It was arguably the greatest moment in Canadian sports history for about 36 hours. On September 24th, 1988, Ben Johnson set a new world record, running the 100-meter sprint at the Seoul Olympics in just 9.79 seconds. Unfortunately, he'll be forced to give back his medal after testing positive for a performance-enhancing drug. Now, a new book described as part biography and part cold case sets out to answer the question: was Johnson denied due process when he was stripped of his gold medal? Here to talk about World's Fastest Man, the incredible life of Ben Johnson, is journalist and author Mary Ormsby. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on, John.
I usually ask authors what made them write the book they're promoting, but in your case, you were there, you covered the race and the events that followed. So, what made you come out with the book now?
It seemed like an open and shut case, as you just alluded to, in 1988, and it happened so fast and it was so scandalous at the time that very few questions were asked. Not a lot of authoritative evidence was challenged, and it just went away for a couple of decades. Over time, I'd kept in touch with Ben, and I asked him, around 2016, do you still have your drug test? I'd never seen it. And that began a paper trail because no, he didn't have it. So I had to go dig into it. So the paper trail began around 2016. And when I began looking at things like his drug test, IOC notes from that time, that's when I thought, you know what? There was something kind of, funky going on in that hearing in Seoul. And Ben may have had a chance to have launched a better defense had he been better equipped. So all that to say, it led to stories in the Star, and then we took it a lot further in the book. And Ben asked me to write the book, and eventually I said yes. So that's how that kind of happened in a nutshell.
So let's go back to 1988 then. Johnson testing positive for an anabolic steroid he claimed to have no knowledge of.
Mhm.
What happened there?
Well, he had been an anabolic steroid user on a program for about 8 years at that point. So, Ben is not blameless in all this. He broke a rule. He knew he was breaking a rule, but to him and his coach, Charlie Francis, they were just keeping up with the Joneses at the time. They figured everybody else who was any good was doing it, so we should do it as well. So the reason Ben was so baffled by testing positive in Seoul was that he'd never failed a drug test before, and after 8 years, they knew exactly what they were doing. They would have a clearance time, stop using the drug about 3 weeks before an actual competition. And back in those days, you were only tested on competition days. Sometimes there was no random testing. So it was a pretty good system. You knew when you're going to be tested. So if you're smart, you're going to be off this stuff. So the shock for Ben was, how did I possibly test positive? I don't take the stuff near race day. So that's where a lot of the questions came around. And then his theory was there was a man in the doping control room. I didn't know who he was, a mystery man, and that was the beginning of Ben's sabotage theory that eventually got sort of laughed out of court.
Johnson claiming this mystery man was seen in his doping room, perhaps had spiked his beers, or at the very least knew what really happened in there. Uh, so who is this mystery man?
Well, it turns out he was a friend of Carl Lewis, part of the Carl Lewis entourage. And Carl Lewis at the time was Ben's most fierce and most bitter rival on the world stage. And that's why Ben Johnson was such an iconic figure in that moment in Seoul. He was a huge international celebrity. And there was this sort of modest, quiet Canadian going toe to toe with this brash, flamboyant, loud, very accomplished American sprinter, Carl Lewis. So all of that was part of this, crazy scandal going on. And Ben, to this day thinks that this friend that he thought Carl Lewis's entourage planted in doping control was in there to spike his beer and, have him disqualified from Seoul.
Now, as a kid, I remember Johnson being presented as a cheat while everyone else in the sport was clean. But as you lay out in the book, Johnson was really part of a culture of doping at that time. You mentioned it earlier, keeping up with the Joneses. There's also, if you don't take it, you don't make it, and all of that. And speaking of Carl Lewis, he had failed 3 tests that summer, but was absolved by U.S. officials. Something not known until a decade or so later. How was that kept under wraps?
Well, Carl Lewis was an enormous star. He'd won 4 golds at the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, and he was able to get wiggle out of his drug problems at the U.S. Olympic trials because, well, first of all, the U.S. officials are very strong, and Lewis did not test positive for a steroid, and you can't have any of that stuff in your system at all. He had stimulants in his urine, and that you're allowed to have a little bit of stimulants, but not a lot, and you can argue it a little bit. So Lewis was able to successfully argue that, I got it out of a supplement somehow. And they went, yeah, okay, no problem, but kept it quiet for about 15 years until a whistleblower, let the world know what really happened. But at the time, he probably should have been suspended at least 3 months, and he would have missed the Olympic Games. And again, that would be an entirely different conversation had that had happened, because then Carl Lewis would have been the first enormous star across the globe to fall into a drug test, and it would not have been Ben Johnson. So, but you mentioned about you got to, if you don't take it, you're not going to make it. That was evident in 1988. It's evident this year. That's why Ben's story resonates now. There are still so many questions going into the Paris Olympics about who's cheating, who's covering it up, and what about this anti-doping system we have now? I mean, there are questions about integrity, about trust for the athletes. Are you hiding some results and not others? So this has been an arm wrestle between athletes and scientists and the anti-doping agency for like 36 years since Seoul. It hasn't stopped. Ben's positive did not end doping as everyone thought it would in 1988.
Well, in a way, that's really the legacy, isn't it? Because the more things change with this, the more they stay the same.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just a matter of who's taking what and who's got the better scientists behind you. And there's a lot of money at stake. There always was. Back in the day, Ben had made millions of dollars as an amateur athlete, and so had Carl Lewis and others. And he lost millions of dollars after the disqualification in Seoul. So you can imagine what kind of money is available, these days, right across the board for women too. Women, all boats rise now with the interest in the Olympics and track and field. So I'm not sure, they'll ever be able to eradicate cheating. They may have to amend the rules at some point to have a little more leeway, but pretty clearly, athletes still feel they need to do something extra, well, some athletes, to win.
So, have we learned anything from this?
I think that in general, the public has become much more educated and aware about cheating since 1988. Because at the time, like I said, it was just such a shock to everybody, and we didn't know how athletes even use steroids. I mean, I was a reporter. I knew what steroids were, but I didn't know how they worked. Now we know so much more. Now you can get a couple of disqualifications and still come back after you serve your suspension. So the public is more well aware of what goes on behind the scenes. So have we come any further? I think it's probably harder to cheat these days, but at the end of the day, athletes still feel they need that extra edge, and it's not always as pure as we hope it would be.
You go into fair depth into the relationship between Ben Johnson and his coach, Charlie Francis, one which you would be considered unhealthy by today's standards. How much of this does Charlie Francis wear?
Looking at it with today's eyes, like Charlie Francis, I know he loved his athletes and I know they loved him, but he would be run out of the game. You cannot advocate cheating. You cannot advocate having young people use drugs that they don't need. So Ben was a very vulnerable young man. His dad was in Jamaica, his family was in Toronto, and he saw Charlie as a father figure, not just a coach. So Ben was very, vulnerable to all of Charlie's suggestions. I mean, Ben was, I think, 19 years old by the time he said, yes, I'm going to do this stuff. But the influence of a coach, that power dynamic is so huge. And when they began to have some success, Charlie, if he were alive, he would probably deny this. But I mean, it also fulfilled Charlie's ambition to break the mold of coaching sprinters, do it his way. And we're not doing anything else the other guys aren't doing either. So, you don't even put, steroids into the equation. But it did probably vindicate him as a coach as well. So Ben's success, allowed Charlie to bask in that glory as well. So I'd say Charlie played quite a big role in influencing Ben's future and his destruction.
Now, Johnson eventually returns to competition. It's short-lived. He would eventually resurface a few times. What do you think was his strangest post-Olympic incarnation? Was it being a personal trainer to Diego Maradona or the son of Muammar Gaddafi or being a pitchman for Cheetah energy drinks?
You sort of like they're all on the podium, all those three you just named. But the one I was probably asked the most of when I talk to people, and I wouldn't even bring it up, but they'd say, that cheetah power drink, why did Ben do that? Most people asked about that, not about coaching Gaddafi's son, which I thought was like, why would you do that? But that was the one that was probably the craziest, was the cheating. And excuse me, as of for Gaddafi's son, Ben's point was, well, I can't get a job here in Canada that's going to pay me the way these guys are going to pay me. So I'm going there. So in some ways, he just felt like he had to be enterprising and take the money when it came his way, because he was only going to get one or two shots at that. So I don't know, if I was going to rank them, I'd say Cheetah for most people would be number one weird. For me, it was the Gaddafi son. That's number one weird for me.
At the end of the day, what can we say about Ben Johnson? Was he in charge of his destiny and soul? Was he led astray by his coaches, his doctors, other forces outside his control?
I think he was a product of the time. It's not to let him off the hook at all, because he is a very polarizing figure. He knew what he was doing. He lied about taking drugs, the performance enhancing drugs, for about 8 months, until he had to fess up on the witness stand in a royal commission called the Dublin Inquiry. So a lot of factors went into play, but I would say at the end of the day, he was a 26-year-old man turning 27. And he was the one who said, I'm going to keep going this way. If he'd been caught at 19, 20 years old, maybe it's a different story, but he'd been doing it a long time, knew what he was doing. And so he does wear a lot of it, and he will say he does. He will say he does. His anger to this day and his bitter resentment is at some of his rivals and the younger people coming up. He says the ones who got away with it, who were doing the same as him. That's what makes him angriest.
You end the book by laying out how he was denied due process, the cold case aspect of the book.
Right.
Do you think that would have changed the outcome had a proper apparatus been in place? Had Canada or the Olympic Committee gone to bat for him in an appropriate way?
I think he would have had a very, very strong case. He may have kept his medal because, as they lay out, there was evidence that wasn't looked at. The Canadian contingent, defending him didn't even look at his drug test. And there were many things they could have challenged. There was evidence used against him that came out of the blue. They had no disclosure, no chance. The Canadians had to go get an expert to rebut anything that the medical commission was throwing at them. And there were conflicts of interest of the people sitting on the hearing panel themselves. They were the IOC Medical Commission people, the scientists. They designed the test, they supervised the test, they did the prosecution, they judge and jury. So there were many things in that mix in Ben's hearing. And even, supporting someone's right to have a fair hearing is not the same as endorsing their behavior. Two separate things, and as a Canadian, as an Olympian, Ben had a right to a fair and proper hearing. I think he might have actually kept his medal had they gone to the mat for him and threw all the artillery at that hearing, the way, let's say, a country like the Americans would have done.
You mentioned earlier that we know so much more about doping in sport. There's so much more in the way of oversight, yet there's still cheating going on. But ultimately, what do you hope the reader takes away from this story?
I'm hoping that they understand that, Ben was not a one-dimensional cartoon character. In some ways, the book is also a character study of a Canadian who was involved in this iconic moment, sport moment in the planet. And he has not been fully understood all these decades, I think, until now. And it's not just my writing. I mean, Ben was really, really good about going to some deep, painful, areas because he was broken many ways, many times along the way, and had to, really just dig himself out of all these bad situations with not a lot of help. So I'm hoping that they understand a young Canadian at the time uh, probably didn't get all the due process, not just in Seoul, but I'm talking about the media as well. Like, I think I could have done a better job back in 1988. Better late than never, I guess. But was that part of racism as well, or just the scandal and shock at the time? I don't know. But I hope that people just have a better understanding of the politics in sport, and Ben Johnson as a human being who would really love to be welcomed back into the sport, but he's banned for life, and he will forever be an outsider.
The name of the book is World's Fastest Man, The Incredible Life of Ben Johnson. It's published by Sutherland House. My thanks to journalist and author Mary Ormsby.
Thank you so much, John.